They thought they were building a dream community, 52 shiny new homes on what they believed was rightfully theirs. But there was one problem. The land still had my name tied to it in a way they never noticed. And by the time they did, it was far too late. I lived on that land for over a decade. Quiet, peaceful, nothing fancy. Just a place I called home. Then one day the HOA decided it didn't fit the vision of their future plans. They called my house an eyesore, slapped me with bogus violations, and without warning, bulldozed everything I owned. No conversation, no compensation. Just a cold letter in rubble where my memories used to be. But what they didn't know was that when I sold the land under pressure, I left one very specific clause in the deed. A legal safeguard, a ticking time bomb that only I knew how to trigger. They never read it, never questioned it. They were too busy drawing up blueprints for their little suburban empire. Fast forward 2 years. 52 homes now stand where mine once did. The HOA thrives. The president struts through the neighborhood like a queen. But the foundation they built everything on, it still belongs to me. And when she found out, she completely unraveled. At first it was little things. Annoying, sure, but nothing I couldn't brush off. A notice in the mailbox about my garden gnomes being unapproved decor. A warning that my mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. Then came the fine for my fence. Apparently it was exactly 2 inches above regulation height, even though it had been there since the day I moved in. The final straw? A formal violation citing my classic '68 Mustang, tucked safely away in my own garage, as an unsightly vehicle affecting community value. It didn't take long for me to realize these weren't just rules. They were weapons, and they were being used deliberately. The woman behind it all? Karen, HOA president, the kind of person who smiled through her teeth while slowly dismantling your life. She ran the neighborhood like her own little kingdom, and I had somehow become public enemy number one. I later found out she had plans, big ones, a new subdivision, community walking paths, a clubhouse, and right in the middle of her blueprint, my land. When the fines didn't break me, they escalated. Suddenly, I was flooded with code violations I'd never even heard of. They cited me for weeds in a yard that was gravel. Then came the letters from lawyers. They claimed my house didn't meet updated community standards. They were laying the groundwork to make it unbearable, hoping I'd sell out just to make the noise stop. But I held my ground until they filed for eminent domain. They argued my property was in the way of community growth, that the neighborhood's development depended on acquiring my land. They painted it as a noble effort, progress over personal preference. I fought it, took it to court, but in the end, they won. They always do when they control the board, the attorneys, and the narrative. I left town for a weekend to clear my head. When I came back, my home was gone, flattened, every brick, every memory, scraped clean off the earth like it had never existed. No warning, just destruction. Karen made a show of it. She gave an interview to the local paper, calling it a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the neighborhood. Said my lot would soon be home to a modern family residence. She even posed for a photo, smiling beside the demolition crew, pointing at the empty dirt like she'd conquered something. What she didn't realize was that I hadn't gone quietly. You see, when they pressured me into signing that land deal, right before the court handed it over, I added something, a single clause, hidden deep in the legal language. It was subtle, but binding, a reversion clause. It stated that if certain conditions weren't met, very specific ones, the land ownership would revert back to me, no questions asked. And here's the kicker. Those conditions weren't even hard. A simple quarterly payment to a holding account in my name for a period of 5 years. Just enough to remind them that the land had history, and that history came with terms. Of course, they never read it. Karen didn't bother with fine print. She was too busy planning her groundbreaking ceremony, and for 2 years everything went smoothly for them. They built 52 new homes, painted white fences, held community barbecues. All the while that one condition sat quietly in the background, waiting for someone to forget it, and someone did. One missed payment, one calendar reminder that never got set. That's all it took. Legally, the land was mine again, every square inch of it. I waited a week to make sure it was final. Then I made my move. I walked back into that HOA office, same one they banned me from years earlier, paperwork in hand, not a word spoken. Karen saw me and nearly choked on her coffee. She looked at me like she'd seen a ghost. I laid the documents on the conference table, flipped to the clause, and watched the blood drain from her face. You missed a payment, I said calmly, which means your foundation, these homes, this entire neighborhood, it's all sitting on land that doesn't belong to you anymore. She tried to laugh it off, tried to bluff. But the legal team backed me up. The clause was airtight. The title had already transferred. Every property deed was now in limbo, and I held the key. I could see it in her eyes, the panic, the realization that she hadn't just lost control. She'd handed it to me on a silver platter. All those fines, all that harassment, all the destruction, and now she was standing on my property, and I was just getting started. 2 years passed. The land that once held my home was now unrecognizable. 52 pristine houses lined the streets, each with matching shutters, polished lawns, and rigid HOA rules enforced down to the letter. The community looked like something straight out of a real estate brochure, orderly, controlled, and completely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath their perfect little world. Karen, the self-appointed queen of this suburban kingdom, had everything she ever wanted. Her name was on newsletters. She ran every HOA meeting like a CEO, and she basked in the praise of residents who didn't know, or didn't care, how their utopia came to be. The board was stacked with her hand-picked loyalists. Rules were made and broken at her whim. And the land beneath it all? They believed it was fully theirs, sealed, signed, and delivered. But belief doesn't hold up in court. Paperwork does. You see, that one clause I'd buried in the original agreement, it was quiet, subtle, and absolutely ironclad. It required a quarterly payment into a neutral trust account, an amount so modest they probably thought it was a meaningless formality. And that was the beauty of it. Because it felt insignificant, they ignored it. Just once. They missed a single installment, one payment. That was all it took to trigger the reversion clause. By the time the legal clock had run out, it wasn't just a technicality, it was the law. I legally owned the land again, all of it, every inch beneath those 52 homes. I didn't go in guns blazing, no press, no drama, just me walking back into the HOA office, quiet and calm, like I was visiting an old memory. Karen was seated at the head of the long conference table, flipping through budgets and agendas like she ran a Fortune 500 company. She saw me and froze. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked with that thin, forced smile she used when she thought she was still in control. "No," I said, setting a thick manila folder on the table in front of her. "But you'll want to see this." She didn't even open it at first. She just stared at it, then at me, like I couldn't possibly be serious. But then she flipped through the documents and I saw it. The moment it hit her, her fingers started trembling, her jaw clenched. And that polished, smug expression? It cracked, then vanished entirely. This isn't possible," she muttered. "Oh, it's very possible," I replied. "And as of last week, it's official. The HOA missed a payment, which means your legal right to the land is gone. All of this, it's built on property you no longer control." The room went silent, but only for a moment. Then the board erupted, papers flying, voices raised, accusations, confusion, panic. Half of them didn't even know the clause existed. The other half looked like they were trying to pretend they did. And Karen? She just sat there, pale and speechless, trying to find a loophole in a document she never bothered to read in the first place. I didn't need to raise my voice. The documents did all the talking. Recorded contracts, timestamps, trust receipts, title transfers, every single piece in perfect order. My attorney had already filed the notice of reversion with the county. There was no undoing it, no appeal, no board vote that could override it. They had built an empire on sand, and I had just pulled the last grain out from under them. Karen stood up, tried to recover some semblance of control. "We'll take this to court," she snapped. "We have lawyers. We'll fight it." "You can try," I said with a shrug. "But it's not your land anymore." "You're trespassing." The word landed like a bomb, because that's exactly what it meant. Every homeowner, every mailbox, every inch of road was now sitting on land they didn't own. Their deeds were tied to houses, not to soil. And the soil? That was mine. Karen collapsed back into her chair, silent, her entire kingdom unraveling before her. She had played the long game to win control. But I had played the longer one to take it all back. Not with revenge, not with rage, but with quiet, calculated patience. The trap had snapped shut, and I was just getting started. They tried everything. As the reality set in, the board scrambled to regain their grip. Karen called an emergency session that night, huddling her inner circle to figure out how they could undo the damage. The next day, cease and desist letters started flying from their legal team. They claimed it was a mistake, that the clause was invalid, that I'd somehow manipulated the documents. But none of it mattered, because the law was on my side, and every signature, every timestamp, every notarized page was airtight. They had ignored the fine print, they had missed the payment, and the reversion clause had done its job. What they didn't realize was how long I'd waited for this moment, not out of spite, but out of principle. They didn't just take my home, they erased it, then laughed about it. They wielded power like a club, silencing anyone who dared push back. But this time, they'd run headfirst into something they couldn't bully or bury. I made it official at the next HOA meeting. The room was packed. Residents, board members, and even a few curious neighbors who'd heard something was brewing. Karen sat at the head, pale but trying to maintain her poise. She hadn't spoken to me since the confrontation in the office. Maybe she thought I'd changed my mind. Maybe she hoped a public pressure would shame me into backing off. But I wasn't there for applause. I connected my laptop to the projector, brought up the original land deed, and zoomed in on the clause, highlighted in bold. The room went quiet as I read it out loud. No drama, no commentary, just facts. This clause states that if the HOA fails to make the required quarterly payment to the land's holding account, full ownership of the property shall revert to the original deed holder, effective immediately and irrevocably. Then I dropped the hammer. Payment was missed on March 15th. Per the terms you agreed to, this neighborhood sits on land that is no longer under your jurisdiction. Effective today, the HOA is hereby dissolved. You no longer have the authority to manage or enforce policy on this property. Gasps, whispers, a few audible curses. Karen didn't speak. She just sat frozen, staring straight ahead like someone who had just watched everything slip through her fingers. But it wasn't over yet. I turned to the residents. Let me be clear. I don't want to displace anyone. I have no interest in selling your homes out from under you. You can stay. You will stay. But things are going to change. I laid it out for them plainly. No more arbitrary fines. No more absurd restrictions about lawn height, curtain color, or how many cars could be in the driveway. The oppressive rules were gone, replaced with a simple, common-sense agreement that prioritized community without stripping people of their autonomy. People clapped. Not all, but enough. Relief swept across the room like a tide. They hadn't known how deep Karen's control ran until it was gone. Some of them even looked guilty, like they were just now realizing they had benefited from a system built on quiet cruelty. And Karen? That was the last meeting she ever attended. By the end of the week, she had officially resigned. She tried to spin it as a strategic decision, but no one bought it, especially not after the audit. You see, during my legal prep, I'd taken a long look into the HOA's financial records, and what I found wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping, it was deliberate mismanagement. Funds missing, vendor deals with suspicious pricing, checks cut to companies that didn't exist. I handed it all over to the authorities. By the time she stepped down, Karen wasn't just humiliated, she was under investigation. The board collapsed behind her. One by one, the rest of them resigned or disappeared. The HOA, once the ruling force of the neighborhood, was gone. Not with fireworks, not with a bang, but with the quiet crumble of a system built on arrogance. And in its place, peace. I hired a neutral management firm to handle shared responsibilities. Trash collection, park maintenance, street lighting, simple things. The rest, left to the people who actually live there. No more power plays, no more Karen. And the irony, The neighborhood thrived. Without the constant pressure of fines and violations, people actually started taking more pride in their homes. Kids played in front yards again. Neighbors talked instead of tattling. For the first time in years, it felt like a community. That was always the point. They thought they could bury me, but all they did was hand me the shovel, and I used it to dig up every rotten root they'd planted. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Cold, legal, final. And the best part? I didn't lift a finger to destroy them. They did it all themselves. They thought they could erase me, that by tearing down my home and paving over the past, they'd win. But all they did was build their perfect little empire on land that was never truly theirs. And in doing so, they handed me everything: power, control, and justice. I didn't just take back what they stole. I inherited everything they built on top of it. But just when I thought it was over, when the board had crumbled, the neighborhood had found peace, and Karen had disappeared into silence, she made one final move, a desperate play, one last attempt to claw her way back into control. And what she did, it changed everything again. But that's a story for another time. Got your own insane HOA nightmare? Drop it in the comments. Maybe yours will be the next one I tell. Like and subscribe if you want more real stories where karma hits harder than any finer rulebook. And don't miss the next episode, where an HOA president tried to evict a disabled veteran and ended up losing her own house instead. You won't believe how that one ends.